all set? Negative team? All right, let's close this out. We provide a compelling advantage because the current system is unacceptable. Since both teams have agreed that justice is the standard that we're using, again, our premise is that justice is not achieved in the current system, and we have demonstrated that consistently throughout this round. If we want to attempt to solve that problem, the only reasonable option is to pass the affirmative team's plan. I'd like to prove that for bringing up a few voting issues, but the first point I'd like to bring up before that is the lack of support from negative. Now, what's very important to note is the only concrete support for the many claims brought up by their evidence was that of Ahmed Gayani. And my partner and I have responded to that consistently throughout this round. The fact that Ahmed Gayani, they brought up that 200 charges were dropped against him, and the response was he still received a life sentence. He was held accountable in a federal court after being initially acquitted in a problem that would have happened in both systems. He was then brought to a commission, which failed, and then was brought back to a federal court and received a life sentence and was held accountable for his crimes. He did receive justice in the end through a federal court, and so that impact does not stand. Because of that, Gayani was the only concrete example brought up by the neg this entire debate. Every single other piece of evidence they brought up was speculating on how standards of evidence could be different and how there could be a threat when those threats were not made concrete. And with that being said, I'd like to move on to my first voting issue, that federal courts have compelling advantages. And this has been largely conceded to by the affirmative team, but it's something that still needs to be emphasized. The first reason is that there's due punishment in due time, as we brought up in our 1AC. That's something that hasn't really been disproven, that federal courts both achieve more reasonable punishments and do so quicker across the board. The second reason is that there's international cooperation, something completely dropped by the negative team. Now again, international cooperation can take place in the current system, but the affirmative team guarantees that it takes place in every situation because federal courts are the only option instead of it being an option sometimes. Because of that, international cooperation is guaranteed. And third, intelligence gathering. Again, something that wasn't responded to because of the fact that they essentially conceded that federal courts work. So they essentially dodged this issue in order to address the second voting issue, and that's one I'd like to focus on, that commissions have no compelling advantages. And the first reason for that is there's no concrete national security threat. Now, the negative team leaned back on the fact that it's still reasonable to speculate or to assume that there are reasons that federal courts could be at risk and that there are reasons that there could be disclosure. My response to this is standards are the same. Again, we're not saying that these harms in this federal court that they brought up didn't take place, but rather that they would have taken place in a federal court and they would have taken place in a military commission. It was a problem, and these were problems that took place, but those problems would have taken place in a military commission. We're not saying those problems didn't happen, but because the standards are the same, as my partner and I have consistently brought up, because those evidence standards are the same in many cases, and in other cases there are exceptions, such as those granted for battlefield evidence and for Miranda rights, because either they are the same or exceptions are granted, every harm that would take place in a federal court would happen in a military commission as well. Because of that, commissions provide no compelling advantages. Because of that, we need to move on to our third voting issue, which is that the disadvantages don't stand to our plan. Again, their first disadvantage was removing a valuable option, and we've consistently proven why this isn't the case. They have not provided a compelling advantage, so we're not removing a valuable option. Their second idea was, again, that we're endangering national security. And my response is the one we've had all this round, speculation. Of course, the idea of having a national security interest is good, absolutely. But the negative team has consistently failed to uphold that by providing any precedent or context for a national security threat actually being real, rather than just the evidence saying that it could exist. That doesn't fulfill the burden of proof for a team policy debate under any metric. The third and final disadvantage was, again, like a burden to state facilities. And we brought up a couple points that addressed this earlier on the speech. We talked about in our 1AC about how federal courts are well equipped to handle criminal cases, and that's why we established federal courts work in our 1AC. We also talked about how 360 Tier 1 high-level terrorists, those convicted under the most high-level charges, have been convicted by federal courts in the last 15 years, since 9/11. And this shows how federal courts are well equipped and have precedent of success in dealing with the most dangerous terrorists. And once again, we need to go back to the agreement I made with Wyatt in our cross-examination, that the main reason they think military commissions should be preserved is because they deal with certain classes of terrorists. But that's not true, because as we've proven, the federal courts are just as well equipped at dealing with these high-level cases. And since we've also proven that there's due punishment in due time, not only are federal courts equal, if not better, equal to military commissions in this regard, but they are objectively better. So going back to that original goal, that original mindset, we believe that federal courts provide compelling advantages, and we have proven that the negative team has not shown compelling advantages to military commissions. Because the advantages stand and the disadvantages do not, And because we need to stand with the perspective held by the experts we provided in our 1AC and the victims who still suffer from 9/11 to this day, we urge you to support and back.